Morning. I'm Reverend Otto Concannon. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the minister of this congregation. So I think I need to begin here at the very beginning with a little bit of a disclaimer. I am not Jewish. I did not grow up Jewish, nor is Judaism part of my practice. I'm not even really related to anybody Jewish. In fact, the bulk of my Jewish experiences have been in Unitarian Universalist contexts. A little bit of Yom Kippur here, a Passover Seder there. And I suppose that makes sense since I'm a UU who was raised with culturally Christian holidays. But I say all this to express that the story of Hanukkah is not my story to tell. We here at First Parish and as Unitarian Universalists are always trying to be aware of something called cultural appropriation, or perhaps misappropriation, where you celebrate a holiday that's not yours in a way that doesn't hold any of the cultural depth and nuance that is important when honoring something. Which is perhaps why our Jewish staff member, who's also our Director of Religious Education, Sarah Krakauer, often leads these services, the ones we hold annually for Purim and our Passover Seder. But this is not a Hanukkah service. It's a service that finds wisdom in the story of Hanukkah, which fits in well with our Ancient Stories theme for the month. And it's a service that acknowledges that Judaism and Hanukkah are part of the cultural fabric not only of our country, but of this very congregation, where we have members and friends who celebrate this holiday for whom this practice is meaningful and who deserve as well to hear about its wisdom. So all that being said, I, a non-Jew, will attempt to explain the origin of the holiday, how it became what it is today, and try to make some meaning of it in the span of about 15 minutes. So bear with me. Our Latka, me, told us a little bit about the story of Hanukkah, but let me lay it out for you. I'll start by telling you that scholars believe that almost everything depicted in the story of Hanukkah actually happened, which is pretty cool for a religious holiday. I'm fond of saying around Christmas, we only really know one thing for sure about the story of Christmas, and that's that Jesus was born. But remember, Hanukkah has nothing to do with Christmas. Thank you, Screaming Latka. So the story begins in ancient Judea, which is the area around Jerusalem where many ancient Jews, most commonly called Judeans, lived. It was under control of the Greeks, a king named Antiochus. I keep getting this wrong. This proves that maybe it's not my story, but Antiochus III. And despite being under Greek control, the Jews had a lot of freedom to practice their religion. And this had been the case for hundreds of years at this point. They lived kind of autonomously in this area with a lot of influence from Greek culture, which they welcomed at the time. Like, it was popular for Jews at the time to continue their practice of religion, but to bring Greek institutions into Jerusalem. So you see, the Judean people were learning Greek and participating in Greek culture because it was very fashionable at the time. And they were able to do this totally fine while still practicing their religion. They found that there was no issue, right? This worked for them. Now, there was one big piece of Greek culture that was not so okay with the Jewish religion, and that was the gymnasium. Now, I didn't know this before I was researching this, but the word for gymnasium actually comes from the word for naked. I don't know if people knew this, but I didn't know this. Because the Greek gymnasium where the Greeks exercised in the nude, right? Now, some folks in the Jewish community were scandalized by this. Apparently, some Jewish men were trying to hide the fact that they were circumcised, for example. And so this starts to be a little bit of tension. Not a big deal, but there are people who start to write about this, including the author of a book called Second Maccabees, which you'll find not in the Hebrew Bible, not in the Torah, not in the Old Testament, but in the Catholic Bible. I'm not even going to start to explain why. So there's lots of internal politics that start to happen, and it gets really complicated. And there starts to be a bit of a bidding war between two men who want to be the high priests of Jerusalem. So there's a little bit of a civil war happening between these two factions of Jews. And the one who goes out, his name is Jason, he goes away to Sparta, which leads to a lot of unrest, right? The followers of Jason were upset about this. And at this time, Greek gets a new king, Antiochus. Thank you, Antiochus the Fourth, and things start to get interesting. Now, due to a bunch of things like this continuing fight, this king hears that there's an uprising in Jerusalem, and he is not happy about it. He's like, who wants to deal with this? So he has an idea to make it easily go away. He issues an edict where he says that everyone in the kingdom has to adopt Greek culture and, most importantly, Greek religious practices. Assimilate, he says, effectively outline the Jewish religion. And furthermore, the Greeks go into Jerusalem and take over the temple, which had been a temple to their god, the God of Israel. And they rededicate it to the worship of the Olympian Greek god Zeus. And the Greeks do this in an attempt to quell this kind of unrest that's happening among the Judeans to bring about unity, shall we say. Now, this is pretty upsetting to the Jews, understandably. They are now required to do things that are against their religion, work on the Sabbath, not circumcise their children, prepare their food differently, right? And this can be on penalty of death. So this tyranny is really felt among the Jewish people. It's kind of a cultural genocide. So of course there was a revolt, as makes sense when one's culture and religion are desecrated like that. I mean, you can imagine if someone came into our space, took it over, and said, this church is no longer a UU church, but a church to practice the oppression of others. It's going to be anti-LGBTQ. It's going to be practice white supremacy, Christian nationalism. This would be against our religion. We folks take our sacred spaces seriously. And I even approve, right? So even I do, right? Even us Unitarian Universalists, I actually approve anybody who's going to perform a wedding or a funeral here to make sure that they're not going to say anything that goes against our values in our space, right? That doesn't desecrate our space. So of course there's a revolt. And it starts not in Jerusalem, but in a small village. And it's led by a man who would become known as Judah Maccabee. But that wasn't really his name. It was a nickname at first that means the hammer. I kind of love that, the hammer. And that's who the revolt gets named after. So Judah Maccabee gets on the bad side of the Greeks and starts collecting people to help with his revolt. And they're sending troops to put the revolt down. But the Maccabees are able to actually make some significant victories, which is very unlikely considering this disparity of power. And the Maccabees are fighting not only those who are imposing laws, but any Jew who's going along with this. This goes on for about 3 years, until the king dies and he's succeeded by his 5-year-old son, who puts out, or really his regents, put out an edict that people can practice the Jewish religion again, because the revolt is clearly worse than whatever was happening before. The temple is returned to the Jews, and the Jews are feeling, understandably, like their sacred space has been desecrated and made impure. There have been practices like pig sacrifices that happened on their altar, which is wholly against their beliefs. So they have to rededicate the temple to purify it so that they can once again practice their faith. And so as they are working on purifying the temple, they find a lamp. It's actually a 7-pronged menorah. And there's one main candle in the middle and 3 on the side. And there was a special kind of oil that was supposed to be used in the lamp that they needed to have be ritually pure. Now, up until this point, there are historical sources that say that all of this happened. The next part, the miracle of Hanukkah, scholars say that this is a story. But stories are important. The story goes, they found a small amount of this ritual oil and placed it in the lamp. And it was supposed to last for only 1 day, but it lasted for 8. Enough time for them to prepare additional ritual oil to keep the lamp lit. And so you get Hanukkah, a Hebrew word that means consecration, that celebrates the outcome of this revolt. They get their temple back, they get to practice their religion once again. And as they're clawing their way back after what I can only assume were devastating battles and crushing imperialism, they get to light a lamp, and that lamp, like them, says, "We are still here. This is our space. These are our sacred traditions." It's a story about resilience, hope when it's hard to see the other side, about fighting tyranny and the miracles that can come after, about sometimes all you can do is light that one candle for one day. All you can do is what's right in front of you. And sometimes that's enough to last for 8. So what do we make of all of this? This story of revolt, of culture and identity, of resistance to tyranny, of hope and persistence and miracle. What do we make of it as Unitarian Universalists, at people in a country where Hanukkah rolls off the tongue as we go through the litany of winter holidays? Well, pluralism, one of our shared values, is one of the ways that we recognize that we all have different beliefs and cultures that we bring with us into this space. And I think it's fair to say that Jews have always had a special place in Unitarian Universalism. The sources of our faith, which you can find at the front of your hymnal, call out our Christian but also Jewish heritage. And we have long been a church where the couple, where one who is part Christian, one part is Christian and the other is Jewish, come to get married and raise their kids. Because here you don't have to compromise on your beliefs. I've officiated more than one wedding where I performed at the request of the couple different Jewish wedding traditions. I've facilitated the breaking of the glass and stood under huppahs for couples with Jewish traditions for whom a rabbi didn't feel quite right. In fact, I've even met families who attended both UU church and synagogue, or people who called themselves Junitarians. There's even a few rabbis, if you can believe it, who have served as clergy in UU congregations. There's a lot about UU that works for folks who maintain a connection to their Jewish identity. Which isn't to say it's easy. I mean, look at our space. There's a cross behind me. There's Christian stories in our stained glass. We meet on Sunday morning and you call me reverend. Things we no doubt get from Christianity. And so many UU congregations celebrate Hanukkah in some way, especially as one does in the US as a contrast to Christmas, or perhaps as an add-on to Christmas. But it's often clumsy. The menorah is supposed to be lit on sundown, but many people wonder, do we light it on Sunday morning if that's when we're here? In Christmas Eve services, if it's during Hanukkah and it's nighttime, do we light it then? These are complicated questions for a holiday that's not about assimilating. In a context, a UU congregation, that should be about preserving all of the traditions of ours that make us each unique. And so it's inherently uncomfortable, right, to light a menorah on Christmas Eve in a church. And it's also uncomfortable to not acknowledge this holiday at all in our congregations. A holiday of anti-assimilation, of saying we are still here. So to the Jewish members and friends of our congregation, I see you. You are still here. And amidst this message of anti-assimilation, there's also a strong message of hope. Something that happened in the story of the Maccabees is that they were the underdogs who won against tyranny. And that hope is present both in their unlikely military victories against the Greeks, but also in the light that lasted for 8 nights instead of 1. Friends, we know something about tyranny right now. Just this past week, some distinguished scholars of democracy published a piece, kind of a rapid response, stating that they believed that the United States was officially an authoritarian state. Competitive authoritarianism, they named it, one where elections still happen, but where critics are punished and systems are in place to influence the outcome. Now, this is hard to hear, and I'm sure none of us are surprised by it. You live here. You've seen the declarations of violence, the overtones of war, the kidnapping of our neighbors, the economic cruelty, the Christian nationalism. I don't need to spend more time listing them. Personally, I already spend too much time reading the news and doom scrolling. But here's what I want to say. The Judeans, the Jews in this time, they felt that way. They had been told that it was illegal to practice their religion, that their culture, their worship, their very way of living was illegal. For those people to succeed against the empire, to regain control of their most sacred space, was a miracle in and of itself. And it came from a tenacity of not giving up hope. And here's the lesson here for us. We have to not give up hope either, because that is so easy to do. Rebecca Solnit said, "Hope just means another world might be possible. Not promised, not guaranteed. Hope calls for action. Action is impossible without hope." The Maccabees lived on that hope, and then in the darkness of their temple, the one they had to purify, to make way, to make true to who they are, after the depths of these battles and years of struggles and strife over this takeover of who they were, in the darkness they found the oil, and they lit their lamps, and they were given a reprieve, that one light that shone for long enough that they could do the work they had to do to reclaim their sacred space, the miracle. And so for us, living under tyranny here, and those around the world who do, which there are many, let us take it as a blessing, passed through time, that we can hope as well, because miracles are possible. May it be so, blessed be, and happy Hanukkah. I want to invite forward one of our affiliated community ministers, Reverend Aisha Ansano, to talk a little bit about our offering.